We like audiences that sit down and listen to the music rather than get drunk and pick up girls and...
Big ones.
Big ones. Bogo de Kazuna. Kazuki. We like audiences that sit down and listen to us.
Is it really true what they're saying? Are you really sure? No, nobody's come for me. When I'm walking home, there is no one. Once there was a house full of laughter, so warm.
Back in the mid-70s, you were either, where I came from, you were either in the Genesis camp or you were in the Yes camp. And I was actually in the Yes camp. And a friend of mine was in the Genesis camp, and he was always plugging Genesis away to me. And he said, come on, you've got to come with me to see Genesis. So I went with him and was smitten.
Genesis in the early days were not a band that set out to entertain by visual aspects.
It's like a piece of dramatic art, I suppose.
Peter Gabriel's musical quirks. Have we got an hour?
Just a glance at the churchyard, casting just a glance at my painted female friend.
And even then I remember the lyrics were hard going, and I mean that in the nicest sense, in that you had to sit down and listen to what they were all about.
It was intense and they were deadly serious about it.
It was maturing, it was developing, it was fascinating, and it was absolutely brilliant. The roots of Genesis were shaped at Charterhouse School, where the founder members of the band were educated. Charterhouse was, and still is, one of the leading private schools in England. From this comfortable, enclosed world, pupils were generally expected to become something in the city or the army. Rock and roll was the last thing on the syllabus of this most English of institutions. But for Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Michael Rutherford and Anthony Phillips, Charterhouse was to provide an unexpectedly supportive nursery for a peculiarly English brand of rock music.
There's no doubt that the five members who made up Genesis initially were influenced by classic English poetry, novels and storytelling.
Charterhouse Public School provided a unique perspective on the beat boom of the 1960s from a somewhat privileged and insulated position. Both the pupils and indeed the teachers at public schools like Charterhouse operated in a fairly rarefied environment and were insulated in many ways from the real world outside.
But the public school experience certainly had a big impact on the boys in the sense that it gave them a kind of a joint feeling that they were rebels. They wanted to do something different and break away from the mould of what they perceived of the restrictions of living in that particular environment. And of course they started playing music together at that time. The Beatles were an inspiration to them.
There were sort of two bands started. Anthony Phillips and I, and Richard Raphael started a band called the Anon with Phil was Job, and the other kind of rival group was Pete and Tony, which also had Anthony as well, so it was sort of a complicated situation. And we started off doing cover versions, as you do, Stones and Beatles songs.
They did things that were not Charterhouse in order to create their own identity, their own image and their own music. However, the most important thing that Charterhouse had was an ex-pupil called Jonathan King, who'd had a huge hit in 1965 with Everyone's Gone to the Moon. And a couple of years later, he crossed paths with these young pupils at Charterhouse.
They were desperate to find somebody to record the music that they'd been writing together. They'd hardly done any gigs at all, and yet somehow they managed to get a tape to Jonathan King, and he was now working at Decca Records as A&R man, and he had tremendous confidence and belief in this band from his old school. He'd heard the tape and he thought they had something to offer. So he offered to produce their first singles. Silent Sun was their first single. Then it came to an album, a full album.
The album I made, which is called From Genesis to Revelation, is still, I think, one of the great undiscovered albums of the 60s, because it's got some super songs on it that will be hits today.
Of course, none of that accounts for the fact that the first Genesis album, I think From Genesis to Revelation, isn't very good at all.
Which sold an astonishing 649 copies on release. Not exactly a huge success.
The advantages of a genteel education count for very little in the rock and roll jungle. You can be born with a spoon of purest silver in your mouth, but you still have to flog your way around the pubs and clubs. The dispiriting life of travelling around in a transit van, playing to tiny, often uninterested audiences, soon took its toll.
Anthony Phillips quit Genesis soon after Trespass was released and after they'd started gigging on a regular basis. He got stage fright, basically. He was also incredibly frustrated that he couldn't produce on stage what they could produce in the studio. And this became, in the end, it started to become a complex, it started to become a phobia, and he admits now that he didn't really confide in the others at that time. Might have helped him, and so, but in the end what happened was he simply made himself ill.
In some respects it was a sort of childhood dream being smashed, although the way I felt at the time I was kind of relieved to get out.
The arrival of Steve Hackett and Phil Collins brought a new dimension to the band.
Steve Hackett went looking for a band and Genesis found him. He actually advertised in the back of Melody Maker, which was the preeminent music paper of the time, saying he wanted to join a band who wanted to break away from the stagnation of what he felt was the music scene at the time.
His guitar work is so kind of it's pretty haunting. He developed a style all of his own, really. When I can remember in an interview with Mike Rutherford was being interviewed, and he said that when he heard Steve Hackett playing for the first time, he absolutely knew he was the right man for the job, because he was making sounds from his guitar that he had never ever heard from a guitar before. And that fitted in beautifully, of course, with what Genesis do, with that kind of work. And before Steve Hackett came along, I think acoustically the band had it all together, but they just needed that ingredient, and he most certainly brought that ingredient. Definitely.
How did I join Genesis? Well, as I said, I advertised in English music paper. And Peter phoned me up. I went along to see them and at a gig. They'd just replaced Anthony Phillips,
Right.
my predecessor.
Right. Was he just on that first album?
He was just on that. He was on Genesis to Revelation and then Trespass. They'd got a guy they weren't really happy with. They'd auditioned a lot of people and they were getting fed up, so they ended up accepting somebody they weren't really happy with. And I went to see them, and I could see why they weren't happy with him. And I thought he seemed to be the weak link to me, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did 2 weeks rehearsal with them, and we played our first gig.
Was that the type of music that, I mean, like you said,
that we're known for now?
Yeah. I mean, also, was the type of thing that you were really involved with?
Yes, I mean, there was a lot of similarities between the things that they wanted to do, and they were doing, and the things that I'd already done, in fact. And quite often I use things with the band now that I wrote a long time ago, not with, not at all thinking of this band in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, there's been a lot of parallel development between Genesis's ideas and mine before we joined forces.
Did your style develop, do you think, after you were in Genesis, or was it?
Oh, obviously, I was very influenced by the others because I'm, to a very large extent, I'm a fan of each of them in their own particular way. Certain things that they do, I mean, each of them have impressed me. I mean, that's really rare to find in a band whereby you're that into the other musicians.
He was a very able guitarist in the mould of Robert Fripp from King Crimson. He was an intelligent axe hero, whereas Anthony Phillips, whom he replaced, was more of a contextual type of guy. He would play what he felt would benefit the song. Now, Steve Hackett, without being rude to him, was very keen to show what he could do.
After something of a false start with the Jonathan King-produced Genesis to Revelation, the band really hit its musical stride in 1970 with Trespass. This was the first album which carried all of the hallmarks of the classic Genesis sound.
This was much more the sound that we came to know of early Genesis, which was released in October 1970, produced by John Anthony and recorded at Trident Studios by a later very famous engineer named Robin Cable.
Trespass came out of a period of intense writing and rehearsing that the band went through after they had decided to become a rock and roll band and left Charterhouse and got over the traumas of their first album. They settled into a country cottage in Dorking and spent 3 months writing, rehearsing, learning to play their instruments and just being together as a band. It was intense and they were deadly serious about it, but it did produce some formative songs that gave Genesis both a direction and an identity. These were songs like White Mountain and The Knife.
The Knife was the song that got Genesis signed to Charisma. They were doing a lot of new stuff in their act, and it was a very impressive kind of statement of intent.
So they were musically starting to explore areas, and songs like The Knife and White Mountain began to showcase Peter Gabriel's ability to tell stories that were a little bit based on whimsy, but also had a certain sense of edge and danger about them. This was something he was subsequently to do with the great later albums that came. But what Trespass was an introduction really to the real world for Genesis.
Dog.
I remember seeing them do The Knife live and thinking, well, this is a band to watch. This was something quite original.
Some of you are going to die. Marching on for the freedom of the mind.